Good evening and welcome. I'm Terry Wilfong, the director of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Graffiti is Devotion Along the Nile, by Geoff Emberling and Suzanne Davis. This is the Kelsey Museum's first event in this building, our new neighbor, the Trotter Multicultural Center. We're thrilled to have the Trotter next door and look forward to working with the staff and constituents of the Trotter in the future. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Bodowadmi. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must keep in mind the ongoing effects of colonization, community struggles for self-determination, colonial state violence, and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. Tonight's lecture marks the opening of the Kelsey Museum's newest exhibition, Graffiti is Devotion Along the Nile, El-Kurru, Sudan, guest curated by tonight's speakers, Geoff Emberling and Suzanne Davis. Geoff Emberling is Associate Research Scientist at the Kelsey Museum and lecturer in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. Geoff is co-director of the International Okuru Archaeological Project. Suzanne Davis is Associate Curator and Head of Conservation at the Kelsey Museum. Suzanne is also Vice President of the American Institute for Conservation. Geoff and Suzanne's exhibition and the theme of their lecture tonight is about the graffiti at the site of El-Kurru in Sudan, where they have brought together a remarkable collaboration that involves cutting-edge imaging technology, innovative scholarship, hard-working excavation, and a strong effort to preserve an archaeological site and involve its local community in the process. I encourage you all to check out this beautiful exhibition after this lecture when we adjourn to the Kelsey Museum for a reception, and also the very beautiful related publication. I give you Geoff Emberling and Suzanne Davis speaking on graffiti as devotion along the Nile.
Thanks, Terry, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming to help us celebrate the opening of this exhibit. Suzanne and I have co-curated the exhibit, and we've decided to divide up the lecture so that I will talk about the broader context, and Suzanne is the one who actually spent a portion of 5 years staring at these graffiti in their context, and she'll talk in more detail about the carvings themselves. So this exhibition presents a group of graffiti that we found between 2013 and 2016 at the site of El-Kurru in northern Sudan. Graffiti are defined, it turns out, in a lot of different ways. And in archaeology in Sudan, what they mean is marks on built monuments. They can be texts or images, and at El-Kurru, we have found only images. So that's going to be the focus of our talk tonight. Today, making graffiti, of course, can be an act of opposition, rebellion, personal commentary. But in the Nile Valley, ancient and medieval graffiti were left primarily as marks of devotion, as we're going to argue tonight. These graffiti are often enigmatic. Much of their meaning remains unknown even after all the study that we put into this exhibition. Let me just see here. Sorry, we'll get back to that. So here's an example of one of these graffiti scenes. And why is it that horses run toward birds? We really don't know. And so there's many moments like that where we can see that there are often quite beautifully, carefully carved images, and their precise significance eludes us. But they still provide insight on religion, on life of people beyond the elite, which is an important theme of this exhibit, on aspects of mobility around the landscape of ancient Kush, and on the salience of certain cultural symbols. So in some ways, we have been able to disentangle the meanings of some of these images, and in other ways, this is pointing us toward future research. El-Kurru is best known, and some of you have heard me talk about this, is best known as a pyramid cemetery for kings and queens of ancient Kush from about 850 to 650 BCE including some who conquered and ruled over Egypt as its 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs. We went to the site looking for an ancient royal city that we had reason to believe existed around these royal burials. We began by looking for previously documented ancient monuments. We never did find a town contemporary with the pyramids, but we did excavate the site's last standing pyramid, which was begun for an unknown king, and that's the large one you see in the reconstruction there. We also excavated an underground funerary temple that was built to preserve his memory. There is, which you can see in the background. Here's the large pyramid. There's the funerary temple that provided the majority of the graffiti that we'll be talking about tonight. Okay. Okay, I'm a little behind on my slides. This is King Tenuta, who was the last of these Black Pharaohs to have been buried at El-Kurru, as represented in a painting in his tomb, and also as represented in a statue found at a nearby site. There's the pyramid. Here, finally, is the temple. So this is an underground funerary temple that was built to preserve the memory of this king. It has an unusual plan with 2 rock-cut rooms that you see in the upper right portion of the plan that were open to the sky, one of which had 26 columns lining it. And then behind that, the rooms numbered 3 and above, a network of entirely underground rooms. These later 2 structures, that is the largest pyramid and this rock-cut temple, were never finished or used in their original configuration, and there was no official decoration and no inscriptions. So, I mean, this represented about 3 years of hard labor, toiling underground in conditions that we were often concerned were dangerous. So the fact that they had never quite been finished and there was no king's name chiseled anywhere on them was initially a disappointment. It's a historical mystery that's interesting, disappointment nonetheless. But we did make an unexpected discovery. The temple and the pyramid were covered with ancient and medieval graffiti. And here's an example of one figure that we found in our first season at the site, just as those columns were starting to emerge from the earth. You can perhaps make out. You may be having a moment that is very much like the process of doing research on these graffiti. There's a Rorschach test, what am I looking at moment that actually can go on for years. But anyway, this is an image of an archer. And you can see the 2 legs that sort of emerge out of that scale bar, a long body, an arm that's holding out a long vertical bow to the right side of the image. Suzanne will be talking about this image in more detail later. So, even though these buildings were not finished, in later times they became sacred sites of pilgrimage. Pilgrims came because they believed these buildings to be powerful, holy places, and they carved graffiti as marks of their devotion. That's our argument. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural context, ancient Kush. Ancient Kush, as some of you will know, was the earliest empire of Inner Africa. Located along the Middle Nile River in what is today northern Sudan, its rulers controlled much of the Nile Valley for more than 2,000 years, from before 2000 BCE to about 300 CE. So this, in worldwide scholarship, Kush is thought about mainly because of this brief episode when they conquered Egypt. But in fact, this was a very long-lived and culturally distinctive empire. So Kush was the southern neighbor of the larger state of ancient Egypt. People moved back and forth, of course, between these cultures, exchanging goods and intermarrying, but the relationship could and often was hostile, could be and often was hostile. During Egypt's New Kingdom, roughly 1500 to 1100 BCE, Egyptian pharaohs conquered and ruled Kush as a colony. After the collapse of the Egyptian empire, kings of Kush conquered Egypt, as I had said, where they ruled as its 25th dynasty. And here's an entire assemblage of these royal statues of kings of Kush found in what's now Sudan. All this interaction led, among other things, to extensive adoption of religious ideas by the rulers of Kush. During the period of Egyptian rule, temples to Egyptian gods were built throughout Kush. This was kind of an implantation of a colonial religion. Kushites particularly worshipped a local form of the god Amun. And that local form in particular is ram-headed. This is a recently and spectacularly cleaned and restored relief from inside a temple at Jebel Barkal, cleaned by some of my Italian colleagues. Okay. In addition, the rulers of Kush also adopted Egyptian funerary traditions, including invocation of the god Osiris and other Egyptian ideas of the underworld and afterlife. Some Egyptian rituals of communicating with deceased kings and ancestors were also adopted in Kush. These included pouring offerings of wine or beer onto stone offering tables that were often set outside burial places. And here you see, you may have to take my word for this, or maybe you can imagine, this is a pyramid, a small mud brick pyramid. And you can see outside two of these offering tables with little spouts that would have allowed the liquid to drain off. In the last phase of Kush, that we call the Meroitic period, about 300 BCE to 300 CE, Kushites began some significantly new religious practices that were not derived from Egypt, including worship of the lion-headed Kushite god Apademak. And you can see him there on the left. Other new practices at this time included this practice of pilgrimage to holy sites and leaving graffiti at those sites, carving images and text into the walls of temples, shrines, and other potent places in the landscape. Still later kingdoms along the Middle Nile converted to Christianity in the 6th century, and the practice of carving devotional graffiti continued in Christian Nubia. Nubia would not become Muslim until the 14th century, 800 years later. Okay. So as I've said, the graffiti are enigmatic. Nobody understands nobody. There is no expert who, in the field who can come and tell you unambiguously what these things mean. So we do not completely understand the graffiti or what they mean, but it is clear that they're not idle doodles. They're concentrated in particular places and appear primarily at just a few sites. Two had been known for a long time, one called Masawarat es-Sufra and the other called Philae. I'll just show you a little image or two of each of those. And the corpus from El-Kurru thus represents a significant addition to what we know about this ancient practice. There's a painting of Christian Nubia showing, well, just to be blunt, showing white saints and a dark-skinned local ruler. This is one of the distinctive features of these of the paintings that appear in the churches and monasteries of medieval Nubia. Okay. So a couple of these sites. Here is this enigmatic site of Masawarat es-Sufra. This is a huge complex of temples, gardens, passageways that is a 2-day journey from the Nile. There's no city around it. It's basically out in the middle of nowhere. Its original purpose remains unknown. Some scholars have speculated that it was used to train war elephants, based in part on this sculpture of an elephant that was part of the architectural decoration of the temple. This has not found widespread agreement, so don't go and quote me on that. But it remains an interesting idea. What we do know is that this was a special focus of pilgrimage during the Meroitic period when thousands of graffiti were carved on its walls. A second pilgrimage site is the island of Philae, located at the traditional boundary between Egypt and Nubia in what's today southern Egypt. Philae was the site of a large temple to Isis, an Egyptian goddess who was also worshipped in Kush. The Isis temple had a particularly close relationship with Kush. It was oriented to the south toward Kush. It included chapels dedicated to two other Kushite gods named Arens Nufus and Mandulus, about whom we don't know all that much. And priests of this later Isis temple were actually appointed not from Egypt, but from Kush. And like Musawwarat Asufra, the walls of the Isis temple are covered with graffiti. Many of these are textual graffiti, partly because we're dealing with priests who are moving back and forth. Kush was a literate civilization, but literacy was very limited, and priests would be the ones who could have written. So in the course of their pilgrimages, they left their names, their titles, sentiments of devotion, and as well as some of the kinds of images that we see at El-Kurru. So with that broad introduction, I'm now going to turn it over to Suzanne to talk about the graffiti at El-Kurru.
So at El-Kurru, graffiti are carved on the walls and columns of the Funerary temple, which you see in the foreground there, and on the facing stones of the Kuru I pyramid. But the largest concentration are in the Funerary temple. So this Funerary temple has more than 500 graffiti, and you can see the density, I hope, in this photo on the right, which shows the northwest corner inside the temple. The graffiti include human figures like these. This is the archer that Geoff showed earlier during excavation on the left. And the graffito on the right shows two figures possibly adjacent to an altar. I don't know how convincing this is to you guys who haven't looked at these things for many, many years, but it seems like a pretty legit thing to me that could be happening there. There are many animals in the temple too. Here you see some horses with a specific type of bird, a guinea fowl. You see a group of 4 guinea fowl, and you see some giraffes. Some animals seem to be related to religious practice, such as small demon-like bullheads with human eyes, and a Kushite version of the god Amun, a ram wearing a double crown. There are objects like textiles and boats, and the boats again are quite faint, but they're really there, I promise. And a sandal you see on the right. There are also religious objects, like ancient Egyptian horned altars. It's a particular type of altar. You see that in the box on the left. There are also offering tables, like Geoff showed earlier in that excavation slide. You see one here with a palm frond. And we also have a small church in the temple. There are also cupules or holes. So these are places where pilgrims seem to have removed the soft stone to take it with them, or possibly to ingest it. So these holes are sometimes carved singly, like the really deep hole that you see on the left, or they're often grouped. Sometimes they're grouped in deliberate patterns, like you see on the right. We can tell when the images were carved in a couple of ways. The first is by image type. So the ram of Amun must date to a period when the Kushite Amun is being worshipped, but the church must be much later, after conversion to Christianity. Okay, I may have just lost my notes here. I'm sorry.
Well, let me just say while you're finding them, we've been looking at these things for 5 years. Every time I look at the slides, I see a new image that's not cataloged. I will tell you about this later.
We were emailing each other today, just as we were working on the presentation about this. We also have carbon-14 dates from a series of pots that had been broken, placed upside down around the perimeter of the temple, and used to burn things. So maybe they were used as luminaries, or maybe they were used to burn incense. Radiocarbon dates from these jars suggest at least 2 discrete episodes of burning between 100 BCE and 100 CE. So based on these 2 methods, imagery and carbon-14, we can say that most graffiti were likely carved in this time window of 100 BCE to 100 CE. So the situation is a bit different for the graffiti on the pyramid. The pyramid has about 40 graffiti that we have found so far. We do find them every year. We see new things in different light. But the graffiti thus far has the pyramid has far fewer graffiti thus far than the temple. Like the temple, the pyramid was built in the 4th century BCE, but later on, during the medieval Christian period, most of its stones were taken away and used to build a fortification wall around the town. So as you can see, this removal of the exterior stones exposed the rubble fill in the pyramid's interior. And over time, this rubble slumped out of the pyramid's core, and it covered the sides of the pyramid, covering and protecting the graffiti. And this was removed in a couple of excavation phases, but largely by the Michigan team working there. So most of the graffiti on the pyramid represent boats, some of which are quite elaborate, and they include details showing rigging and navigation. And this boat, the big boat on the left, you can see it has a little triangle at the end there. That's actually a rudder. So that's the kind of little navigation detail that you can see. It also has big boxes on the deck, and these are representing cargo. A few other pyramid graffiti are animals, including camels, as you see here on the right. And on the left, and this is one that we were corresponding about today, we have something else, and we think maybe it could be an ostrich. There are also monograms on the pyramid, as you see here on the left. These are stylized letters in different scripts that represented the initials of saints or archangels. So the pyramid graffiti can be dated based on the Christian period monograms, on the types of boats represented, and because we know that the base of the pyramid was buried by the pyramid's own rubble fill, as the courses of casing stones were removed. So these 3 pieces of evidence allow us to date the pyramid graffiti to around the 9th to 10th century CE. So quite a bit later than the temple. Graffiti at El-Kurru pose a big preservation challenge. They're carved into soft sandstone that cracks and erodes when it's exposed to wind and rain. And as the surface weathers, the graffiti can be lost. The temple had also flooded several times in the past, so the graffiti were caked with mud when we first began to study them. In 2016, we began a project to conserve and document the graffiti, and we began with careful cleaning with brushes, as you see here with our colleague Abdel Baki, and also with bamboo skewers for mechanical removal of the mud accretion. Once the graffiti were clean, we cataloged them, taking photographs and recording their dimensions and basic descriptions in our project's research database. We also recorded their preservation condition, and every year we recheck that in the field and we assess any cracks or other problems that we see with them. Sometimes this annual checkup reveals that conservation treatment is needed to preserve a graffito. And I'll just talk to you about one simple treatment that we do, which is grouting, just like you would grout the tile in your bathroom. We are grouting cracks in the stone column so that water doesn't get into the stone and cause the graffiti to separate, flake off the surface. At El-Kurru, we use a grout that's made from lime and sand mixed with water, and you can see us mixing test grouts on the left and grouting a crack on the right. And when this sets, it seals the crack so that water can't penetrate, and it also helps hold cracked sections of the stone in place. As part of this project, we've also worked to catalog and preserve the graffiti virtually, primarily through a special type of computational photography called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. And the way this works is that the camera that you set up remains stationary, focused on a graffito, while multiple photographs are taken as the graffito is lit from about 50 different directions with a portable flash. Two reflective spheres, the glossy black balls that you see in the big image on the left, are placed in the image to provide reference points. And after the photography for a graffito is complete, the photographs are processed with software that merges them into a single file. The highlights on the spheres are then used by that software program to calculate the many possible lighting options in the final file, and this allows the viewer to play light across the surface from any angle. Regular photography of the graffiti is difficult because many are worn and they're hard to see, and it's often unclear what they're supposed to represent. So it's difficult when you're photographing them and you haven't thought about them carefully. It's difficult to know what angle to choose for your photograph. RTI is really useful for this because it records surface texture. And of course, it lets you light the graffito from any angle. So this is an example that I'm hoping to show you. This is the graffito of the archers. It's in just normal lighting conditions, and my colleague Janelle is kind of blocking out the sun with her hand there. So the sun is setting, and so we're shooting into the sun in this image. And okay, we're gonna see if this works. I'm gonna try to go out to these links so that we can see them in RTI Viewer. These are on our exhibition website. Okay, so here is that graffito again. And I just want to show you that if you light it from this angle, now you can see the figure's kilt. You can see his arm here more. If we light it from here, you can start to see this arm more and the bow. So you can just like have a disco experience with him. It's pretty cool. And let's see if I can get back now to the PowerPoint. I have two more to show you, and I think we have plenty of time. So these are two of my favorite graffiti on the site. These are the little bulls. We call them bullheads or demon cows. So again, like, let's just start at the beginning. Here you see it in normal light. Here we can go to the side, and you can start to see their horns, their little hooves more. You can see their little nostrils in some angles. Maybe over here we can see their little nostrils a little bit better. These guys are really cute. They are favorite graffiti for many of us working on the project. And one more, Ram of Amun. So important, the Ram of Amun. Okay, so again, starting here, very kind of washed out. We have a flash, probably too close to it in this image. But if we go around, you can start to see something in front of the ram. Do you see this thing here? Not sure what that is. Don't know if the artist made a mistake maybe when carving, or if it's something that's in front of the ram. Maybe the ram is carrying something, maybe it's wearing something. I don't know. You can kind of see a little tail here. You can see his fleece. The ram has some nice little fuzzy fleece. In some angles, you can kind of see his eyeball too. So we have about 60 of these online on our exhibition website. We have 6 of them available to view in the gallery. So, you know, you could spend some time with them. I realize I probably like them more than anyone in this room will ever like them, but it's kind of fun to play with them, you know? And this, I had just an image from the RTI file in case we couldn't make the links work. And we've shot now all the figural graffiti in the temple with RTI and most of the figural graffiti on the pyramid. So we haven't done it to all of the holes, right? Like I told you about the holes. We don't have RTI of all the holes because you don't really need that. But so this is hundreds of graffiti, and we hope to make them all publicly accessible in the future. But right now we do have about 60, at least, I think, online on our exhibition website. One reason that it's good for us to be able to share them publicly is that you then learn a little bit more about them. So, for example, this is one that we learned about from colleagues at the site of Musawwarat Asufra. So you can tell that this is something, but it's kind of hard to tell what thing it could be. Well, it turns out it is a dog on the left chasing a hare on the right. We have 2 of these scenes at El-Kurru, and we have 7 of them at Musawwarat Asufra. And if I had had time, I would have like drawn the dog on here for you. But you can see this one in the RTI files, and then you can see it more clearly for yourself. So this is the frustrating and really exciting thing about these graffiti. They're a window into this vanished world and into the thoughts of individual people, but those people didn't leave us an interpretation key. So here are a few other things that we don't completely understand. We have a number of these textiles, and that they're textiles is pretty clear, but we don't know why they're carved in the temple. These pose the same problem. This is an X in a box design, and it is all over the place, sometimes in combination with other things. And one theory is that they represent altars. Another theory is that they represent flags. We actually have some fans on display in the Kelsey right now that have this kind of X decorative scheme in the middle. There are a lot of them in the temple, so they definitely mean something, but we don't know what. Okay, here's two more. On the left is a particular type of bird, the guinea fowl again. Designs of these birds are common on Kushite pottery of the Meroitic period. We know what they are, but we don't know why they're being carved in the temple. On the right are giraffes. And again, the giraffe part is obvious, but this part of Sudan doesn't have giraffes, and it probably never did. So why are they here? One explanation for images like these is that they're part of folklore, an important part of a Kushite world and Kushite stories that we don't know. But while there are mysteries yet to be solved, we have learned a lot thus far. For example, overall, the corpus of graffiti at Musawarat, Philae, and at El-Kurru includes images related to offerings, such as offering stands and tables, images related to movement associated with pilgrimage, like sandals and feet, horses with riders and boats, and other religious symbols, such as sacred animals, and also crosses and churches. We believe, therefore, that the ancient and medieval graffiti in the Middle Nile region were primarily marks of personal pilgrimage and worship. The graffiti are especially compelling to us because they're not part of a sanctioned decorative scheme determined by the state, like by a king or by a priest. They're instead marks that are made by regular people who are expressing their thoughts and hopes. And before we move next door to the Kelsey exhibition, we wanted to share some information about its creation. So first, our goals for it were to provide context and information about the enigmatic ancient phenomenon of devotional graffiti. But we also wanted to communicate a sense of place and a little bit of what it's like to be at El-Kurru, and we wanted to share with you the sense of discovery and of exploration that we feel when we're there. So to do this, the Kelsey's exhibition design team, our colleagues Scott Meyer and Eric Campbell, created columns to suggest those in the temple at El-Kurru. And these are hand stenciled with graffiti designs, all of which are derived from actual graffiti at El-Kurru. And Eric Campbell, who's responsible for all the graphic design work in the show, chose a dark gallery paint to evoke the temple's subterranean rock-cut character. Large photographs on the didactic panels and as banners highlight the setting and show the local landscape. The Nile River, which is wending its way along our gallery floor, shows El-Kurru's location in relation to Musawarat Sufra and Philae. There's also a soundscape of a typical workday on the El-Kurru excavation recorded by artist Florian Rothmeyer. If you don't have time to linger in our galleries tonight, the exhibition is also online in a gorgeous website that was built by Julia Falkovich-Kine. And the website has resources the in-gallery exhibition does not. It has a full catalog of the graffiti with their RTI files. And it has videos that we took on site featuring different El-Kurru team members, like our colleague archaeologist Sami El-Amin, who is with the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums in Sudan. If you'd like to learn more, we're having a free half-day symposium on September 20th, and you can see our website to register for this. We also have an exhibition catalog Terry showed earlier. It features essays by us and by 5 of our colleagues from around the world. It's edited by our fantastic colleague at the Kelsey, Leslie Schramer. You can buy this in print in the museum's gift shop, or you can download a free copy from our website. We have other cool merchandise in the Kelsey's gift shop as well, including mugs with images of our graffiti that are made by a local Ann Arbor potter, Irina Bondarenko. And your purchases, of course, support the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. Okay, so we are getting close to the end here, and I just want to say one last thing. So for tonight's reception, we wanted to have Sudanese food for you, but we couldn't find anyone to cater that for us. So if you're good at cookery and you like Sudanese food, take note of this market niche that has not been filled. So we're looking instead to Sudan's close neighbors in Northeast Africa, Egypt and Ethiopia. And tonight we'll be sampling several Ethiopian dishes, and we hope you enjoy them. So thank you for your attention. We have acknowledgements. I don't know if Geoff wants to come back up for this. You want to say anything about all of the people who have supported us and to do our microphones?
Just go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so we want to especially thank the International Okuru project team, with special thanks to Sammy, who you saw in that little video clip, and to Bruce Williams for his careful study of the pyramid graffiti. We're really grateful to the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums in Sudan. That's like the Sudanese version of the Ministry of Culture, and especially to Dr. Abdelrahman Ali, who is the head and a big supporter of our work. We're thankful to the whole staff of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, not just the folks I mentioned by name, but lots of other people support the exhibitions at the Kelsey and support our field research program. We had special help on the exhibition website. Julia, I mentioned before, but we also had help from Chris Broussard and from Peter Knoop, our LSA IT advocate. And then we had a bunch of financial sponsors for the exhibition. The University of Michigan College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, the University of Michigan Office of Research, the African Heritage and Humanities Initiative of the African Studies Center of the University of Michigan, and Ms. Kathleen Picken, and they supported the exhibition, the catalog, and a lot of the events that we're doing too. So we're very thankful to them.
So we will now take any questions.
Yeah. I think one of these microphones interferes with the microphone for the questions. We're going to find out. And we will ask you to use the microphone, please, for questions so that it can be picked up by our videographer.
Okay. In looking at the RTI image of the bowl faces, it almost looks like there's pigment. Did you actually notice pigment while you were there on site?
Yeah, so Geoff and I disagree about whether there is pigment in those graffiti. Geoff thinks that there are.
Just based on the fact that it's kind of red. This is not an expert opinion, I should hasten to say.
And I think that there's not pigment. The sandstone is like multicolored, it's made up of all of these little quartz grains, and it has this cementation matrix, and so there are a lot of different colors, and some of the stones are more rose and some are more gold, and they can be mixed. And that one I don't think has pigment, but there is one where we both agree. There's a horse with a rider. It's quite fancy. We don't show it here. We didn't show it here tonight, but you can find it on the website. And the horse's legs do appear really red, and like more red than the surrounding rock. So, yeah.
Hi, Geoff, when you started, you talked about the definition of graffiti. Is that your definition of graffiti for this project, or could you just talk more about the general definition?
Yes, of course. I mean, we had this conversation with Terry that, I mean, even there's even a difference between how, this is how archaeologists in Sudan define graffiti and how we talk about it in that little sub-community of scholarship. It's different in Egypt, where graffiti can include inscriptions in the landscape that are not on built monuments. We didn't really talk about this, it's mentioned in the exhibit, but rock art is clearly a related phenomenon that in Kush has a much longer history. And analytically, we just distinguish graffiti as being things that are associated with built monuments as opposed to places in the landscape. But obviously, these well, maybe it's not obvious, but these are similar phenomena in the sense that, like the graffiti that we're talking about, the rock art is clustered in certain locations in the landscape. Not all rock outcrops have, what's that? Oh, how about that? And actually in the area around El-Kurru, a lot of these clusters of rock art also have these features called rock gongs, which are stones that have different sounds when you hit different parts of them, and clearly they've been hit a lot of times in the past. So those two are, I would argue, ritual, special meaning kinds of activities. But anyway, so the short answer to your question is the way we're using it is just the way that archaeologists who work in Sudan use it.
Mike. I was really interested in many things that you said, but the graffito that you identified as textile almost looks like it's on a loom. And are there multiples of these? Okay, well, it just occurred to me that way back when I was doing some research on Kuranis and the temples of Kuranis, that the papyri, that we have tell us that priests were the weavers at the temples. And I don't know whether that would apply to, the site here, but it almost seems as if it could be something of a ritual activity at the site.
That's an interesting...
Possibly in relation to pilgrimage and...
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it is true that there are Meroitic textiles that are known from burials, and a new feature of Meroitic agriculture was the cultivation of cotton. And so this is a feature of exactly that time period. So that's good to know about the temple connection. Thank you.
And that's interesting, Elaine, because the fringe is not even. Like you probably noticed that the fringe on the bottom is always a lot longer. So it does look like a warp that's being pulled. Yeah.
I had a specific question about your initial comment you made. Is it an accepted conjecture that it's an unfinished site, and how that would have somehow had the influence on the art that was actually placed in that area?
Yeah. Well, there's so this is a whole other talk documenting that point, but just to cut right to the chase, we got down into the inner burial chamber of the pyramid and found a roughly shaped coffin bench with a 10-foot long granite slab, roughly shaped, that they were getting ready to put back on the back wall. They had started to carve a little place for it on the back wall of the burial chamber, and then they just stopped. And so normally when a burial has been, when someone's been buried and then there's been looting, there's all kinds of broken stuff around, but there was just nothing at all. So that's not a looting situation, that's a situation where it wasn't finished. We also have, I noted that this rock-cut temple plan is unusual. There's one other example that is like it, and it's at a nearby site called Nuri, also a royal pyramid cemetery. And that one, they did finish. It has relief carvings on the cross wall. And so we know what it should look like if it were finished. So we feel pretty confident about that, but thanks for asking for details.
And just to be clear, it's just these two monuments that weren't finished. So there are a lot of other monuments at the site that are finished and they have this interior decoration and we know who was buried there. So. But
it's interesting that of all the possibilities at the site, it apparently did not matter that these were unfinished from the perspective of people who came centuries later to do these pilgrimages. So it raises an interesting question about what the aim of the pilgrimage was. It's sort of, I'm imagining that it's something like, the memory of the great kings of the past. Something, and of course kingship in the Nile Valley in Egypt and in Kush is closely connected to the divine world. So that's my guess. It's my personal guess.
Thank you for the details.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to find out how time intensive these works are. Do you have a sense of, could one of these graffito be made in a couple of hours? Would it take repeat visits? Do you see any proof of graffito that were finished by another hand? I'm just curious because it might tell us something about how the places were visited.
Would you like to weigh in on that, Suzanne? Not really?
So we haven't tried to make any, but that's kind of a next thing that I would like to do. And for the symposium that we're having in September, I'm hoping to get some sandstone that we can try carving. And Jim Cogswell, who's an artist, I don't know if Jim is here tonight, but he is the discussant for the symposium, and we've talked to him about this quite a lot, and he pointed out to us that there's a meditative aspect to making these kinds of carvings, that it's repeated marks in the stone. And he also has given us some other things to think about, and since we've talked to him, I've been thinking a lot more about this. You can tell if the person was right-handed or left-handed based on how the image is carved, and that's kind of a little detail that I wouldn't have thought to look for. But we haven't thought a lot about what it's like to make them yet.
So I could just add a couple of things to that. One is the stone is super, super soft. I don't think we emphasized that as much as we could have. I mean, you can scratch it with your fingernail. So that barrier is not much of a barrier at all. It's also true that, as you will maybe have noticed, some of them are just very rudimentary kind of lines gouged in, and some of them have relief, are more bas relief kind of and more elaborate. So there's a range of different hands and different skill levels that are attested in the corpus. I can't think of an example where there's like a mix of those two styles in a single, so there's nothing that crude, somebody started and then somebody with a very different skill level came along and finished, but yeah, thanks. Yeah, how come all of our questions are from this side of the room? What's going on with this side of the room?
I'm correcting the balance. Thank you. This is so much fun. My question comes from Iberia about 1,000 years later. I've done some study of church graffiti in 10th and 11th century Iberia, and one of the things that I noticed there is that there is a lot of repetition of just geometric forms. So I'm wondering if maybe the forms that are really bothering you, you don't know what they mean, maybe what they mean is in the act of inscribing them. And that the forms themselves, I'm sure you've thought of this, but those are easy forms to cut.
Right.
So
no skill required.
The forms that we have that we have in the churches that I've studied in northern Spain, they're compass cut. So you could just stick a compass in the wall and go. But the fact that you're making them in this holy place, the process of making them and the place where you're making them maybe is certainly as significant, but maybe even more significant than the actual form.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you've thought. But I just had to say something about the 10th century in Spain.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think you're right. That it's a mark of presence.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you could imagine people like me who have no ability to carve a horse or something might want to leave a mark like that.
It continues praying for you after you're gone. At least for early medieval Christians, that was the way it was. I don't know whether it would have been
really?
for y'all.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to know whether you found anything like somebody's name. Like the graffitis that we see today, is somebody writes their name or the club membership or something, or send a message to some other people that are coming there or had been there.
Well, in a word, no. At El-Kurru, because there's no text, so there's no names. At Philae, lots and lots of names. So it depends on the literacy of the people who are doing the carving, and so this goes to this question of mobility. How far away would people be coming to El-Kurru? We know because of the text at Philae they were traveling 700, 800 kilometers from the capital at Merowe, the capital of Kush in Merowe, to Philae. So that's and we know this because they were using texts. I would guess that El-Kurru, the catchment area, the region from which the pilgrims are coming is more constricted. It's just a guess.
So from
Wait.
this idea of right hand and left hand with graffiti, could you tell whether there was a relationship between the handwriting or the images that you would say that this is the same person? Or?
I personally could not tell yet, but it's possible that we could get to that place. Yeah. And we do have a plague. There was a very brief plague of like middle school age boys carving their names in the temple. That was a brief period of time before site guards figured out what was going on and figured out how to stop it. But so there was a modern edition of some names for a while. Yeah.
The other thing I cannot stop myself from saying, I'll try to say this in a polite way. I mean, it's quite remarkable that in all of these images, there's none of the kinds of images that we might think about in modern graffiti. You know, I mean, there's no sort of bad boy images, just, you know. So that's interesting. I mean, that's part of what makes this point about this being a different kind of idea of what the graffiti are doing.
So the holes.
Oh.
Sorry. The depressions.
Yeah.
The holes. Is this a Okuru specific phenomenon, or do you see it elsewhere?
Yeah.
Has there been any epigraphic
go to
work on fertility cults? Because you know there is this phenomenon throughout Egypt.
Yeah.
But you know those in this case vertical grooves.
Yeah.
That had to do with ingestion and were related to fertility cults that were celebrated by women who would sneak off to the temple and gouge out some.
There hasn't been a formal study of this in Sudan, but there's enough anecdotal evidence that it's certain that that's what this is. They're taking the material of the temple and eating it for health and fertility. And there's an interesting, we have one panel in the exhibit that describes this, but I'll just say this, that there's a modern analog to this, which is that there are two ancient tombs that have paintings in them. One of them is the tomb of a queen. At the entrance to her tomb, there's a big pile of dirt from the excavation. Women from all around will come and take dirt from that pile and leave offerings there to a group of women who are spirits, jinns, who are called the Banat Sheikh, the daughters of the Sheikh. And this goes back to a 19th century religious figure who lived in the village, who married a woman who turned out to be a jinn herself. And so then these Banat Sheikh, you know, haunt and help the village. And so by coming and leaving an offering and taking this, you can get healthy and you can have children. So I mean, it's hard to connect those dots 2,000 years back, but it's kind of tempting somehow, all the same.
Oh, that's fascinating. But I guess then, just a final part C to the question, could that be a local thing and the other images relating more to a pilgrimage aspect? I mean, has settlement been pretty consistent at Okuru?
Yes. Probably not constant, but I mean, you know, the settlement in this part of the Nile Valley is more or less just a band of villages all along, and so I think that's been pretty much the way it's been.
We don't really know how far people were traveling, like what constitutes pilgrimage, you know? It could be.
No, but I guess I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
you know, if that has to do with fertility, maybe that's local women, and maybe these other things relate to people who are actually have a different purpose and are coming from elsewhere.
Yeah.
You think we could do more with the holes, is what you're saying?
The holes are interesting.
They are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Yeah. Sure.
627. 627.
Tying some things together, I was wondering, do you find the squares with the X's that, as Catherine said, might just be geometric repetitions, also reminded me very early on in your talk of, I can't write, but I need to sign as an X. So do we find those at sites where there are more name graffiti, or are there fewer of them?
There are. They have them at Fili too. I don't know about the exact numbers and the proportions, but yes, they are definitely there. But I mean, you would expect that not everybody who was making a pilgrimage to the Isis temple was, yeah.
And as a remark to the missing of body part images would actually be, I don't know, maybe just a Greek Roman background, fascinating, because devotional objects can relate to that. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Hi, I'm sorry I came in late. Did you say, is there calcium in basically in that rock? Is it calcite? So sandstone, I was just wondering because pregnant women need more calcium because they're growing a couple sets of bones and teeth, and so it's like a dietary supplement.
Yeah, my coworker Carrie pointed that out to me today when we were talking about this today. So it is a calcium carbonate cementation matrix for the stone. So, I mean, I can't imagine that you would know that when you were eating the stone, but I mean, maybe there's a core, you notice oh, women who are eating the stone are having better outcomes. I don't know, but yeah. Yeah.
So I think we've had plenty of time. We're going to be here. Okay. We're going to be at the reception, so if you have other questions, we're happy to continue talking either in the exhibit or over a glass of wine. I want, before we go, on behalf of one of our sponsors, the African Studies Center, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you are interested in being notified about other Africa-related events, is that right, Enrique? Yeah. Please sign your name and email. And with that, would you like to call us?
I'd like to thank our speakers and then invite you over to our reception. So thanks a lot.